was serious, needed to be discussed. The china was out, the good napkins. My father had that tight posture he used when he was about to present something, as if it were already decided. My younger sister Claire sat beside him with swollen red eyes and trembling hands. I knew she'd been struggling with infertility for years. 3 failed IVF cycles, 1 miscarriage. I had held her while she cried. I had driven her to appointments. I loved my sister. That's what made what came next so brutal. We've been talking, my mother began, folding her hands neatly. As a family, I felt something tighten in my chest. Whenever she said as a family, it meant a conclusion had already been reached without me. My father leaned forward. Claire deserves a child. I nodded slowly. Of course she does. Claire reached for my hand. The doctor said it's possible, she whispered. With a surrogate, I felt the air thin. My mother continued before I could speak. And we believe this is something you should do. Should, not would consider, not might think about. Should. You're healthy, my father added. You're not married. You don't have children yet. It makes sense. As if my body were an empty guest room, waiting for occupancy. I stared at them. You're asking me to be a surrogate. We're not asking, my mother corrected gently. We're saying it's your responsibility as her sister. The word responsibility hit harder than the suggestion itself, because in this house, responsibility had always meant sacrifice. I was the dependable one, the one who never caused trouble, the one who stayed practical. Claire was fragile. Claire needed protection. Claire needed comfort. I needed to be strong. This isn't a small favour, I said carefully. It's 9 months of my life. For family, my father replied. Family carries each other. I looked at Claire. Her eyes were pleading, not manipulative. She wasn't forcing this. She was drowning, and my parents had decided I was the life raft. You don't even want kids right now, my mother added softly. This won't disrupt anything. That was when something inside me shifted. Not anger, not tears, awareness. Because they weren't offering me a choice, they were assigning me a role. What if I say no? I asked quietly. The silence that followed was cold. My father's voice dropped. Then I don't know how. You can call yourself part of this family. And just like that, motherhood became a loyalty test. They called it duty. They called it sacrifice. They called it love. I called it something else entirely. And buried inside the paperwork they handed me that night was a single clause they had not read carefully enough. The folder they slid across the table wasn't just a suggestion. It was a contract. Legal documents from a fertility law firm. Non-disclosure agreements. Medical waivers. Compensation structure. It was organised, tabbed, and pre-highlighted, like someone had already anticipated my resistance. My mother smiled faintly. We've handled everything, she said. That sentence unsettled me more than the demand itself. They hadn't approached me with vulnerability. They had approached me with logistics. Claire squeezed my hand tighter. I didn't want it to be like this, she whispered. I believed her. That was the cruel part. She wasn't weaponizing me. She was desperate. But desperation doesn't erase consent. I opened the contract slowly, scanning paragraphs with the same analytical calm that had gotten me through law school. Yes, law school. The irony was almost laughable. They were asking a contract attorney to sign a contract without reading it. My father leaned back confidently. It's standard, he said. I didn't respond. Standard doesn't mean fair. Standard doesn't mean ethical. Standard just means common. The medical provisions were clinical and precise. Hormone injections, embryo transfer, psychological evaluations, insurance clauses. Claire would retain parental rights. I would waive maternal claims. All expected, all heavy. My chest tightened slightly as I reached the financial section. They had structured it not as payment, but as family reimbursement. The amount was minimal, enough to cover time off work, not enough to acknowledge physical risk. That wasn't what stopped me, though. It was the clause near the bottom, Section 14.2, parental mediation and future contact. I read it twice, then a third time. My parents hadn't noticed it. They were too focused on the moral framing of the situation. The clause stated that in the event of future familial estrangement, I would retain visitation rights to the child until age 18. Visitation, legal visitation, which meant something important. It meant the law acknowledged potential fallout. It meant the firm drafting. This had seen families fracture under similar arrangements before. I closed the folder slowly. You read this? I asked calmly. My father waved dismissively. It's routine. Routine. I looked at my mother. You understand this legally binds us for decades. She stiffened. We trust each other. That was the moment I realised they hadn't truly read the contract. They had skimmed it emotionally, not legally. Claire looked confused. What does it mean? She asked. I met her eyes. It means they're planning for the possibility that this tears us apart. Silence drops like a weight between us. My father frowned. Don't dramatise it. I'm not, I replied quietly. I'm clarifying it. They thought this was about pregnancy. It wasn't. It was about leverage. About who controlled what after the sacrifice. They framed it as duty, but the contract framed it as risk management. Let's take action and embrace inner peace. Achieving inner peace is a personal and unique journey. Here are some general approaches that might be helpful. 1. Meditate regularly. Meditation encourages a clear mind and calm spirit, allowing you to disconnect from worldly concerns and focus on your inner self. 2. Maintain physical health. Regular exercise, a healthy diet, and good sleep habits can significantly improve your mental state. 3. Spend time in nature. Whether it's a walk in the park, stargazing, or listening to the ocean, spending time in nature can effectively help you achieve peace. Let's take action and embrace inner peace. And if they wanted to talk about responsibility, then we were going to talk about it legally. I slid the folder back toward them. I'll need amendments, I said. My mother blinked. Amendments? Yes, I replied calmly. If I'm risking my body, I'm not doing it without protection. And that was when the power dynamic began to shift. My father looked at me as if I had just insulted the entire concept of family. Protection from what? He asked sharply. From you. I didn't flinch. From consequences, I replied evenly. From assumptions. From future erasure. My mother folded her arms. This is exactly why we said you're the practical one, she said, like practicality were a character flaw. Claire's eyes moved back and forth between us, confusion and fears mixing in her expression. What amendments? She asked softly. I turned the contract back toward me and flipped to the final pages. If I do this, I said carefully, I want full medical insurance coverage independent of yours. I want long-term health monitoring covered. I want a legally documented financial trust established for the child that cannot be altered without my written consent. My father's jaw tightened. That's excessive. No, I corrected calmly. That's realistic. I paused. And one more thing. They all waited. If at any point I'm cut off from the child, financially or emotionally, I want full legal parental recognition until age 18. Silence swallowed the room. My mother shook her head immediately. That defeats the purpose. What purpose? I asked quietly. She didn't answer, because the purpose had never been mutual. It had been simple. I carry the child. Claire becomes the mother. My role disappears. But contracts don't disappear. They document intent. You don't trust us? My father demanded. I met his gaze without raising my voice. You made this transactional. Claire finally spoke, voice trembling. I don't want to lose you. That sentence hit deeper than the rest. For a moment, I almost softened. But love doesn't erase logic. Then don't, I said gently. My mother leaned forward, anger creeping into her tone. You're making this harder than it needs to be. No, I replied. I'm making it clear. That was the real issue. Clarity makes emotional pressure ineffective. My father stood abruptly. If you cared about your sister, you wouldn't need conditions. I looked up at him calmly. If you respected me, you wouldn't call it duty. That landed hard. Claire's hands were shaking now. I don't want this to destroy us, she whispered. I held her gaze, then stopped treating my body like a family resource. The silence that followed was no longer defensive. It was unstable. They had expected resistance. They hadn't expected negotiation. My mother finally said the quiet part out loud. If you don't do this, we don't know how this family survives. I nodded slowly. Then maybe it was never built on choice. The folder sat between us like a mirror. They thought I would sign out of guilt. They didn't realise the contract contained something else entirely, a clause that would force them to confront their own conditions. And they still hadn't read it properly. My father pushed the contract toward me, again as if proximity would force my compliance. You're overcomplicating something simple, he said, voice strained. Claire needs help. I didn't look at him. I looked at the fine print they had ignored. Section 22(4), Surrogate termination rights. I had noticed it earlier, but now I read it out loud. In the event of familial coercion or psychological duress, the surrogate retains unilateral authority to withdraw participation without penalty. I let the words hang in the air. My mother blinked. What does that mean? She asked, suddenly less confident. I looked up calmly. It means if I can prove I'm being pressured, the agreement becomes void. Claire's breath caught. My father's face hardened. No one is pressuring you. I held his gaze. You called it my duty. Silence. You said I'd no longer be part of the family if I refuse. He didn't deny it this time. My mother shifted in her seat. That was emotional language, she muttered. Contracts don't care about emotional language, I replied evenly. That was the difference between us. They were arguing morality. I was reading liability. Claire leaned forward, eyes wide. You would actually use that clause? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I closed the folder gently. I'm not threatening anything, I said calmly. I'm clarifying what this really is. My father exhaled sharply. It's generosity. No, I corrected. It's leverage. The word unsettled them more than anything else I'd said, because leverage implies imbalance. It implies someone holds more control than the other, and they were just realising they didn't hold as much as they thought. My mother's voice softened slightly. We just want a grandchild, she said. There it was. Not Claire's dream, not my health, legacy, image, continuity. Then support Claire, I said gently. Don't assign me. The room felt smaller now, like oxygen had thinned. Claire's eyes filled with tears. I didn't want it to feel forced, she whispered. I believed her. That was the complication. This wasn't villainy. It was fear wrapped in entitlement. Then it can't be, I replied softly. My father ran his hand across his forehead. If you walk away, this tears everything apart. I stood slowly. If I sign without consent, it tears me apart. That was the real fracture line. Not between sisters, between autonomy and expectation. My mother stared at the contract again. We didn't read it carefully, she admitted quietly. No, I said. You read what you wanted. The clause wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. It was protective. And protection changes negotiations. They thought I would fold. Instead, I stood. And the conversation was no longer about duty. It was about consent. The room felt heavy after that. Not explosive. Not chaotic. Just strained in a way that exposed every assumption that had been quietly sitting beneath the surface for years. Claire wiped her eyes and leaned back slowly. I didn't want this to feel like pressure, she said, voice unsteady. I believed her. That was the hardest part. This wasn't a villain twirling a mustache. It was a family that had never learned the difference between love and obligation. My father finally sat down again. The authority in his posture had dissolved into something closer to uncertainty. We thought you'd understand, he said quietly. There it was again, understand the word they used every time they wanted me to sacrifice without protest. I do understand, I replied evenly. I understand that you see me as the solution. Silence. No denial this time. My mother's shoulders sagged slightly. You've always been strong, she said. You've always handled things. Handling things doesn't mean I owe you my body, I said calmly. That landed in a way none of the legal clauses had. Claire looked up at me. If you don't do this, I don't know what I'll do. That wasn't manipulation. That was fear. I walked over and sat beside her. Then we explore other options, I said gently. But they're choices, not assignments. My father shook his head. Those treatments are expensive. I turned toward him slowly. So is pregnancy. The silence that followed was sharp but quiet. They had framed this as emotional generosity. I had reframed it as physical risk. You think we're using you, my mother said, voice barely above a whisper. I didn't hesitate. You are. Not maliciously, not intentionally, but undeniably. The truth wasn't dramatic. It was structural. For years, whenever something became difficult, they looked at me. When money ran tight, they looked at me. When paperwork needed reading, they looked at me. Now, when motherhood became complicated, they looked at me again. Claire took a slow breath. If I asked you without them, would it be different? The question stunned the room into stillness. My parents looked at her sharply. I met her eyes. Yes, I said honestly, because then it would be a request, not a verdict. My father leaned back, defeated in a way I hadn't seen before. Not angry, not proud, just recalibrating. We approached this wrong, he admitted. That was new. My mother didn't argue. She stared at the contract like it had betrayed her expectations. You're not our backup plan, she said softly. No, I replied. I'm your daughter. And for the first time since dinner began, I no one contradicted that. The clause hadn't ended everything. It had ended the assumption. And assumptions are often what destroy families, not disagreements. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniable. My father leaned back in his chair and exhaled like a man realizing he'd been arguing with the wrong premise. We thought this was about sacrifice, he said slowly. It is, I replied calmly. Just not mine alone. Claire looked between us, still shaken but more grounded. If I ask you, she said carefully, not because Mom and Dad expect it, but because I genuinely need you, would you consider it? The question felt different, lighter, not a verdict handed down at the dinner table, a request between sisters. I didn't answer immediately. I needed them to understand that consent isn't negotiated under pressure. I would consider it, I said finally, but on my terms. My mother shifted. Your terms feel legal, I almost smiled. Because this is legal. Pregnancy isn't symbolic. It's medical, it's physical, it's risk. For years, my parents had operated under emotional language. Duty, sacrifice, loyalty. I operated under clarity, and clarity changes power. My father nodded slowly. If we remove the expectation, he said, almost thinking aloud, and treat it as your choice. And then it becomes my decision, I finished. Claire swallowed hard. And if you say no, she asked quietly. I met her gaze steadily. Then you'll still be my sister. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. It wasn't tension, it was relief. For the first time that evening, the room felt breathable. My mother's eyes softened slightly. We didn't realise how controlling it sounded, she admitted. You didn't realise because you weren't the one being controlled, I replied gently. There was no hostility in my tone, just accuracy. My father finally closed the contract, folder, and slid it away from the centre of the table. We'll amend it, he said. No pressure clauses. No emotional ultimatums. He looked at me directly. No more duty language. That word hung in the air. Duty had always been the tool they used to justify expectation. Now it was being retired. Claire reached for my hand again, but this time her grip wasn't pleading. It was steady. "I want this to feel right," she said. "Not forced," I nodded. "Then give it space." The clause that could have avoided everything had instead exposed the imbalance, and imbalance once visible can be corrected. This wasn't the end of the conversation, it was the end of assumption. For years, my family had relied on my silence. Tonight, they finally learned that silence doesn't equal agreement, and consent cannot be extracted through guilt. It has to be offered freely, and the following weeks felt unfamiliar in the best possible way. No one mentioned duty. No one framed my body as a solution. Claire and I met alone at a cafe instead of around the dining table battlefield. It was the first time the conversation existed without our parents, expectations hovering over it. She looked tired but calmer than before. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Not for wanting a child, not for struggling, for how it was handled. I didn't realise they were pushing you that hard." I stirred my coffee slowly. "They weren't pushing," I said evenly. "They were assuming." She nodded. "That's worse." There was honesty in her voice now, not desperation. "If you say no," she continued, "I won't let them treat you differently." That mattered more than she probably realised. "And if I say yes," I replied, "it won't be because I was cornered." We both understood the difference. Consent given under pressure fractures families. Consent given freely builds them. Claire leaned back and exhaled. "I've started looking at other options," she admitted. "Different clinics, different surrogacy agencies." I raised an eyebrow slightly. "Good. I don't want this to cost us," she said. I met her eyes steadily. "Then it won't." The shift wasn't explosive. It was subtle and structural. When we returned home that evening, my parents were noticeably restrained. My father asked, "Did you talk?" Claire nodded. "Yes." He didn't press. My mother glanced at me cautiously. "Whatever you decide," she said carefully, "it's yours." That sentence was small but monumental. For the first time, my autonomy wasn't being negotiated. It was acknowledged. Later that night, I sat alone at my desk with the amended contract in front of me. The coercion language had been removed, the emotional ultimatums erased. The surrogate agreement now read like a legal partnership, not a family expectation. I traced the clauses with my fingers slowly. The decision still wasn't simple. Pregnancy isn't a symbolic act. It's physical risk, emotional complexity, long-term consequences. But it was now my decision, not theirs. That changed everything. My phone buzzed with a message from Claire. "No pressure. I mean it." I smiled faintly. That was growth. Not perfect, not polished, but real. The clause that could have voided everything hadn't destroyed the family. It had forced them to confront their assumptions. And sometimes the most powerful boundary isn't the one that ends relationships. It's the one that resets them. 2 months passed before I made my decision. In that time, no one brought it up unless I did. That alone told me something had changed. My parents adjusted their language. My father stopped speaking in absolutes. My mother stopped framing sacrifices. Love.Claire scheduled appointments with independent surrogacy agencies and invited me only as support, not as obligation. The shift was subtle but steady. One evening, we gathered again at the house. No contracts on the table this time, just dinner and conversation. After dessert, Claire cleared her throat. "I've been approved through an agency," she said calmly. My mother looked relieved. My father nodded once. Then Claire turned to me. "I want you involved," she added. "Not as a solution, as my sister." I held her gaze for a moment. "You don't need my body to keep me," I said softly. She smiled faintly. I know. That sentence meant more than any legal amendment. The pressure that once defined the conversation was gone. In its place was choice. My mother looked at me carefully. "You told us something," she admitted. "We didn't realise we were framing everything as duty." I didn't respond with triumph. I responded with clarity. "Love doesn't need ultimatums," I said. My father exhaled slowly. were afraid, he admitted. Afraid of losing time. Afraid of losing legacy. I nodded. Fear doesn't justify control. Silence followed, but it wasn't defensive. It was reflective. Claire reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You were never the backup plan, she said quietly. I almost smiled at the irony. For years, that's exactly what I had been. The practical one, the reliable one, the one expected to absorb whatever pressure arose. Now that role was dissolving, not because I walked away, but because I refused to carry what wasn't mine. As I drove home that night, I realized something simple and powerful. The clause in that contract hadn't ended everything. It had ended the assumption that my autonomy was negotiable. My parents had tried to define my love as sacrifice. I redefined it as consent. And once that line was drawn clearly, the family dynamic recalibrated. Not perfectly, not magically, but honestly. Sometimes the strongest boundary doesn't tear relationships apart. It forces them to grow up, and growth, unlike guilt, lasts. The final shift didn't happen in a courtroom or across a dining table. It happened quietly one afternoon when Claire called me from the fertility clinic, her voice steady instead of fragile. They found a surrogate, she said. No desperation, no guilt, just information. She's kind. She understands the risks. I closed my eyes briefly, absorbing the simplicity of it. I'm glad, I replied, and I meant it. Months earlier, that call would have carried tension, unspoken pressure, a sense that I had failed if I wasn't the one stepping forward. Now it carried something different, relief without resentment. Later that evening, my parents came over for coffee. My mother placed her hands on the table and looked at me directly. You were right to stop us, she said quietly. I didn't rush to answer. She continued. We were so focused on what we wanted that we forgot to ask what it cost. That was the root of it. Not malice, not cruelty, just tunnel vision wrapped in entitlement. My father nodded slowly. We confused obligation with love, he admitted. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of those words settle. Love doesn't demand proof, I said calmly. It respects limits. Silence followed, but it wasn't strained. It was reflective. Claire arrived shortly after, smiling in a way that didn't feel forced. The agency handled everything professionally, she said. No guilt, no assumptions. I met her eyes. That's how it should be. She walked over and hugged me. Not tightly, not pleadingly, just normally. For the first time since this conversation began months ago, I felt something steady instead of defensive. The clause in the contract had not been a weapon. It had been a mirror. It forced everyone to see what they were doing, how easily love can turn into pressure when fear enters the room. As we sat together that night, I realized something important. If I had signed immediately, resentment would have grown quietly beneath the surface. Instead, clarity had replaced assumption. My parents no longer spoke in ultimatums. Claire no longer framed motherhood as something I owed her. The family dynamic didn't collapse. It matured, and that was the real outcome. My mother once said it was my duty to carry my sister's child. She believed sacrifice proved loyalty. What she learned instead was this. Loyalty without consent is control, and consent given freely is the only foundation strong enough to hold a family together. The clause didn't end everything. It ended the imbalance, and once that ended, everything else had room to breathe. Months later, when Claire's surrogate was well into her second trimester, we gathered for a small family dinner again. No contracts, no ultimatums, no subtle tension beneath the conversation. My mother placed her hands on the table and looked at me differently than she ever had before. Not as the dependable solution, not as the strong one who could absorb pressure, but as an equal adult whose choices mattered. I'm proud of how you handled everything, she said quietly. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't performative. It was grounded. I nodded once. You listen, I replied. That was the shift. For years, I had spoken calmly and been dismissed as overthinking. This time they had listened. My father leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. We almost broke something permanent, he admitted. Not because of what we asked, but because of how we asked it. That was the truth. The request itself was complex but understandable. The assumption behind it was what fractured trust. Claire reached across the table and squeezed my hand gently. You didn't walk away, she said. I looked at her carefully. I didn't need to. Walking away would have ended the pressure, but it wouldn't have corrected it. Staying and setting boundaries had done something far more powerful. It had forced everyone to confront the difference between sacrifice and coercion. Later that evening, my mother stood beside me at the kitchen counter. You've always been the strong one, she said. But strength doesn't mean availability. I almost smiled. That sentence would have been impossible for her months ago. No, I replied calmly. It means awareness. The room felt lighter now, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was clear. The surrogate pregnancy was progressing well. Claire was excited but steady. My parents were involved without overstepping, and I wasn't carrying anything that wasn't mine. The clause in that contract had never been about voiding an agreement. It had been about forcing honesty into a conversation that would have otherwise relied on guilt. And guilt, once exposed, loses its power. As the night wound down, my father walked me to the door. You taught us something, he said. That family doesn't mean obligation. It means choice, I nodded. And choice requires respect. He held my gaze for a long moment before adding, we should have respected you. Sooner, maybe, but growth rarely arrives on schedule. Sometimes it needs a catalyst, and sometimes that catalyst is a single clause buried in a contract that no one bothered to read carefully. That clause didn't destroy my family, it redefined it, and redefining something is often the only way to save it. The day Claire's baby was born, I stood in the hospital hallway, watching my parents hold their grandchild for the first time. There were tears, there was laughter, there was relief so visible it almost shimmered. I didn't feel distant from it. I didn't feel excluded. I felt aligned. Claire walked out of the recovery room later, exhausted but glowing. She hugged me carefully. Thank you, she whispered. Not for carrying a child, but for staying. That difference meant everything. My mother joined us, eyes softer than I had ever seen them. We were wrong to make it your duty, she said quietly. It was never your burden. My father nodded in agreement. No defensiveness, no excuses, just acknowledgement. I didn't respond with a lecture or a reminder of how close we had come to breaking. I simply said, we fixed it, and we had. Not through sacrifice, not through guilt, but through consent and clarity. The clause in that contract hadn't been a threat. It had been protection. Protection for my body, protection for my autonomy, protection for the version of me that deserved to be asked, not assigned. Months ago, when my parents said it was my responsibility to carry Claire's baby, they believed love justified pressure. What they learned instead was that love without choice becomes control, and control fractures families. Respect rebuilds them. Standing there in the hospital corridor, I realised something simple and permanent. I hadn't refused motherhood. I had refused coercion. I hadn't rejected my family. I had rejected the imbalance inside it. And once that imbalance was named, everything shifted. Claire's child would grow up in a family where sacrifice wasn't demanded as proof of loyalty, where boundaries weren't punished, where love wasn't conditional on compliance. My mother once framed it as duty. My father once framed it as family obligation. But the truth was quieter and far stronger than either of those words. The clause ended everything that wasn't healthy, and it protected everything that was worth keeping. That was the real ending. Not dramatic, not explosive, just steady. And steady is what lasts.